Okay, we're going to begin. I have to say, I've had the pleasure of talking with Darren Wagner for a short while, and I wish we could have taped that because that was so rich, and I have no clue where this is going to go. But let me first introduce myself. I'm Kathy Bettman, or Associate Professor Kathy Bettman, and I'm Deputy Dean of Counselling and Psychotherapy at Ken Miller Institute. But I'm here in my position as a member of the research committee of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Educators. And our goal is to promote research and publication in Australia. So I'm honored and delighted to have as my guest today, Darren Wagner. I'm so excited because I happen to be reading the Sydney Morning Herald and came upon his incredible story and thought, wow, if I could talk to Darren, I will have made it. And I can't believe that I've done it.
Oh,
But
Kathy.
no, but it's true. And when I look at your resume, I think, wow, where does anybody begin? So I'm going to let you introduce yourself if you don't mind. So thank you, Darren. And please introduce yourself to the viewers.
Thank you. And thank you for this invitation and such a warm look. It was lovely to meet you. I think we decided it was better to hit record because we would have just kept talking, which is nothing, there's nothing wrong with that. So I enjoyed that. But so thank you for the lovely invitation. And thanks to all the viewers. So I'm Darren Wagner. So I'm currently, and I have to practice this, I'm currently a PhD student. So I'm studying at the University of New England, 6 months in as a brand new PhD student candidate. I'm also a lived and living experienced researcher, so really starting to find my feet in that space. And look, a real passion for trauma, suicide prevention. So obviously, you alluded to my story. So a lot of what I bring to the table is that lived and living experience. So we've started to even change that language around living. Often those researchers or participants, and then mental health consumers, I hate that word, really don't, as an American, don't like that word as a consumer. I honor the history of the mental health challenges of people that had to, give themselves a label because we were given labels throughout history. But I'm finding my feet as a lived and living experience because a lived experience says that that's something that happened to me in the past. As someone living with a mental health challenge or concern, this is something that just become part of my genetic makeup. It's who I am. I manage it. I live with it. But I'm also finding that it's also a strength. I've gained a lot of wisdom, over the years in this space.
So can we talk a little bit, as much as you're comfortable with, your journey? Because you started off as a policeman, and
Mm.
so that's very different from being a PhD student at UNE. So can you talk a little bit about that journey, which I know was your lived-in experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, when we had time to reflect on who we are, who we were, I started out probably as a 15 or 16-year-old. Now I apologize, I've got a printer going, so somebody's actually sending printing into my office. So if you don't
Can't
hear it,
hear it,
that's
so don't
great.
worry. Keep going.
I'm like, of course, someone decides to print a ream of paper. Maybe it's a novel. I don't know, but anyway. So doing reflection on who I was, I found that, even as a 15, 16-year-old, I started out as a lifeguard, then went into, so I really had this, I wanted to support, to help people, to be there. Somewhere along the way, I also wanted to be an actor. So I moved to San Jose, California. I went to a high school of performing arts. I fell in love with the theater. So I found the theater a very safe space from a mental health point of view. As a teenager, being up on the stage was a very safe environment. Parents divorce as they do. I'm shipped off to a little rural community where theater's not valued. So one does what they do. When you can't make it on Broadway, you become a cop. And spent 10 years in that space, in a very rural community, but still is actually one of the saddest cities in America from multiple polls. So lots of suicide, lots of homicide, lots of gun violence, just a lot of trauma. And going through the police academy, we had never studied mental health. But yet when someone was in a mental health crisis, people would dial 911 and we would arrive with no training and deal with people the best that we could. Now, not being skilled as the counselors watching this and aspiring counselors would know, look, it's challenging to be with somebody, but when you don't have the skills, even harder. So what I didn't realize was that each of these interactions was building up in me, building up as a young man. We didn't debrief, we didn't discuss. You just go to the next call. So 10 years of that led me to winding up having memory issues, and then eventually going to the doctor to go, look, having these, I couldn't remember where I was at yesterday. And all of a sudden I'm having a flashback from 5 years ago on a fatal car accident, and it was vivid. And so you go to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, you've got PTSD. And I said, no, you weren't listening to me. I'm a cop, I'm not a veteran. I had never understood that there was a civilian equivalent to it. And this was good old DSM-3. So as a police officer with a mental health diagnosis, you're deemed broken. Nobody really wants to work with you because you're not fully there. They need a partner that's going to watch their back. So there's a real culture around being unwell mentally. And so I was discharged with no future. My psychiatrist at the time told me that, I would never work again, just wouldn't work. And I would always be on antipsychotics. So that was my future. So after about a year of that, I did attempt to end my life. And it made sense to me at the moment because it would have provided financial security and stuff. So it was accident. It was only by an accident that a fellow deputy had dropped by and interrupted it. Otherwise, I shouldn't be here. Then you're taken to the mental health unit where I put all of those people in that unit, and going, well, no, I'm having some memory problems. I'm feeling hopeless, but I'm not crazy. Those people in there, they're crazy because I put them in there. This is what I knew of mental health. So because I didn't want to go in, I was kind of forcibly taken in, medicated, physically restrained. So the good old padded cell, as you would say, and they're highly romanticized. That idea of padding, it wasn't. It was very uncomfortable. It was very dehumanizing. And the next morning, I was asked to come out and join a group, and I said, "For what?" They said, "Well, it would be an art group." And I'm like, "I don't want to do art. I don't want to live." So they said, well, if you want to come out, you need to join the art group. And I'll never forget it. There was a little plate, some elbow macaroni, and a little white bottle of Elmer's glue was their way of dealing with my hopelessness. So it was really in that moment that I went, you people have no idea. You really don't understand how to work with me in that space. So long story short, you get out, I self-isolated at home, and this was before COVID. So I was one of the early pioneers at self-isolation. So I stayed at home for 2 years, not wanting to go back out into the community, into that space, because I was quite well publicly known as I had the dog. So I was a dog squad person. So everybody knew me. And there was a lot of shame in that. Met my wife, Australian, and she convinced me. She said, you ought to come and come to Australia and visit. So I looked on the map, and as classic avoidance would be, that was about as far on the planet as I could get away from my traumas. So from that, I went, okay. So arrived here, looked around, nothing was familiar. The police cars looked different. Actually, they looked silly. Little blue and white checkered cabs that ran around. I thought, oh, I like it here. So our sons were born here and, reinvented ourselves here.
And then,
And then, okay.
but as you're talking, I'm thinking about so many things. I've got Richard Schwartz, FSI, sitting on my shoulder talking about parts. There was part of you that was totally broken, totally helpless, didn't want to live, shamed, all of that. And then there was that other part that looked and said, you guys don't know what the hell you are doing. I know better than you do. And all along the way, there's this part of you that's gone, I know better and I'm going to do more.
That was the quieter part. So that part did know. So that part it just didn't have a voice. So that part knew, but I couldn't, I could not express this. I couldn't question the treatments. I couldn't question the methodologies, every drug known to man that was injected into me. I became quite a good guinea pig for science as far as what works and what didn't. And unfortunately, none of it did. But avoidance was really the first way of me managing by going, I feel better, I feel safer, I feel removed from that. So we had two sons. We were born here in Sydney. Then we moved up to Queensland, and I reinvented myself again as a photographer because I thought, well, you can avoid trauma, and this was still wedding photography, and don't there can be trauma around wedding photography, the brides, when they're very unhappy. But I loved working with people. So working with photography, working with people to capture beautiful little moments, because the only other photography I'd ever done would have been crime scene photography. So a lot of still life photography, kind of early days. So moving forward, it was lovely to have real people in real little moments, then showing them these images that they didn't see of themselves. So I was able to capture these little moments, these beautiful little moments that they hadn't seen, or they didn't see themselves as that person. I don't take good photos. I'm not pretty. I'm not this. Oh, look at that. Can I get that framed? And just giving them positive, giving them happy memories. So the fact I felt like I was able to give countless happy memories. But our sons, because it was very rural with Sundays, very rural, 2 hours to the nearest cinema, we decided to move back to the States. Now that wasn't an easy decision because they'd never lived there before. My wife at the time was again, very, very concerned with the gun culture because she had watched Bowling for Columbine with Michael Moore. So there was a real fear. So she, being a very diligent researcher, looked up crime statistics, found us one of the safest, communities, close to water. She's an Australian girl, so you got to be close to the water. We wanted to keep that rural lifestyle, but still be close to the big city. So we were about an hour from New York City in a state called Connecticut, in a little village called Sandy Hook.
Just by the way.
Which, by the way, so there hadn't been any violence there in 20 some years. So, 2 years into reinventing ourselves, removing ourselves from trauma, and feeling safe, feeling part of a community. We got a message that there had been a school shooting. So it was in that moment that my world kind of stopped. And luckily one of our youngest son had stayed home that day. So we were very, very fortunate to know that one of our children was safe, but the other was off the radar. And he was at the high school. He just started high school that year. So we didn't know which school. There was no news. So my rational brain kicked in. I thought, look, I'm gonna rationalize this out. That's not really happening. Sadly, it was. So after making contact with my son, who had barricaded himself into his classroom, he had been getting live texts from his friends from the elementary school where there was the actual shooting. And he knew the news probably about 30 minutes before CNN. So it was a very surreal moment to be watching CNN, watching the ticker tape, getting the live update from my son about really who had passed away and how. And then watching very limited information come out on CNN and the helicopters and the news trucks. So it was through that experience that I was reintroduced to the world of trauma, because I'd never told my sons that I'd had PTSD. They knew me as Dad, the photographer, who used to be a cop. So knowing that now they had been exposed to this, horrendous, unspeakable act, having their innocence stripped from them, I needed to come out and have that conversation and say, I never told you why I left and how it affected me. So we started having dinner time conversations about what that looks like and what it feels like. And then I became an accidental counselor because all of my friends who had lost children, the first responders who had never, no one, you could never prepare for such a scene, working with them, working with the community. That was kind of my accidental pathway back into trauma, working with some amazing people that have endured unspeakable acts. And then it was through that I started being invited to other communities. So, the Aurora movie shooting and lots of other places and spaces where communities have been impacted by mass homicide and then suicide. So it's that kind of gave me my, look, I would say that should be a PhD in itself. So those experiences should have qualified me for at least an honorable PhD in the worst of humankind as well as the best. So I've seen both sides of, what people are capable of as a police officer, as being on these scenes, and the outpouring of love. So people coming and being with other people, giving of their time, of their love. Our community was swamped. I mean, and by swamped, I mean we had to hire a warehouse because we had so many greeting cards from around the world that we had to hire a warehouse for all of the art and the gifts and the books, and everyone who had ever written a counseling book sent our library was the size of a small house, and semi trucks would pull up from publishers that had, from the tapping techniques to this modality, every modality that someone had that was they thought would be a benefit, the books would arrive. So that really was my baptism into and reintroduction. I thought being a civilian, naively was going to, protect me. But what I found was that, I'm quite fortunate to be able to sit with people and hear the stories that no one else can or wants to. Because one thing that I was taught very early on when we would go to Washington and people would say, I can't imagine what happened to you, to your community. I said, oh yeah, you can. You can absolutely imagine. You choose not to. I said, as humans, we don't want to identify with something in us that would make us feel that uncomfortable. But it's because we're not doing that, because we're not imagining what it would be like, these things continue to happen. So I always challenge that. I know that it's a well-meaning thing, but we can imagine and we have to sometimes imagine. And I think as counselors, I've started to really develop a passion about how do we safely go into those dark places with people, to be with them. Yeah. And
I
we can.
think what was stood out even before where you got to was the strength of community and the healing in community. I'm sure both for yourself, although that's not quite what the object was, but also for the community in doing all that the books and the greetings and the being together. That sounds incredibly powerful.
Mhm. Yeah, and we did come together as, I mean, I'd never experienced anything. It was a small community. So we did come together and we had to very quickly, within the first week or two, I mean, we came together as a community. We had President Obama come and pray with us. Um, and then the outpouring of love was, and I realized that people needed to do this. So as much as they wanted to help us, there was a real need for themselves to deal with this event that's, you don't want to think about. This couldn't happen. So because we were only an hour from New York City, we were the Broadway, the performing arts community reached out to us and said, we'd like to put on a show for you. And I said, well, that's very kind of you. Just for the families that have been impacted. So a one night only a Broadway show for, to take our minds off of something. And I said, well, that's lovely. I said, but so we've got some great kids still here, some kids that love performing, and they would love to be part of this. They would love to dance. They would love to sing with you. So we came up with this idea. It was called From Broadway with Love. And we had 600 people, lighting, directors, performers, dancers, technicians for a one night show, free. Sesame Street. So I got to work with Sesame Street around, but they contacted us and they said, look, we need to do something. We can't sit with this. We want to come and do and provide what we do best. But it's for you, but it's that reciprocal. It was also for them. So it was for me very surreal to be on stage and be introduced to Bob, who taught me my alphabet, and to be introduced to Bob and go, they were like, Darren, this is Bob. I know. I'm like, no, I know Bob. You taught me my alphabet. So the tears started, and the next thing that I know, I felt this big blue paw. I looked behind me and it was Cookie Monster wiping my tears. So I went at this moment, my life as I knew it had been changed forever. I've been exposed to something that was historic, monumental, horrible, evil, beautiful, and these emotions just came and went like the tide.
This is so
So
fascinating too, because Bessel van der Kolk talks about acting as a form of therapy for trauma. And
yeah.
how wonderful that that opportunity came up and that you were part of it and that you gave the idea of these fabulous kids being part of something like that as well.
It was a beautiful night, and it became something that we created an ongoing once a year. People from Broadway would come and work with the next generation of kids at the high school, and we would put on we would all combine and do the show of the year. But we would have Broadway talent coming to work with us, and it still exists to this day. It's still going. So there is this, it wasn't just a once-off show. It created a culture of healing through the arts in the community. So that was it was very life altering for me.
Wow. So you came back though to Australia. So
I came, I still call Australia home. Yeah. So after 2 years of it wasn't okay just to ignore the gun violence. So as much as I was passionate about the arts and the healing, I wanted to see if we could, especially being a police officer, if I could address some sensible gun legislation. So we tried to do that for 2 years, but the culture was too ingrained. I'd started receiving death threats because of my activism. And I realized that probably a career pathway of being a martyr wasn't, probably one of the best career choices I could make.
yeah.
So what I did learn was by being with all the people that have been impacted, I think, as I said earlier, that whether they were victims or survivors, and that was their choice of how they saw themselves. I thought I need to gain some skills to continue being with these amazing people. So I thought, well, I'm going to come back to Australia, and a boy that didn't graduate high school, and I'm going to do a certificate in mental health. Um, and I did. I came back and I did that. And then I got so I went to a diploma. And then I had these amazing mentors at the right time that said, well, why aren't you doing, a graduate? Why aren't you going for why aren't you going for a master's? So 2 years ago, I completed a master's by having these amazing mentors at the right stage of my life that challenged me with loving kindness to say, look, you're passionate about what you're doing, and you're able to do this. Have you thought about you need to do? So 2 years ago, finished a master's, and it was only in the past 6 months that through through some, the Manna Institute that I was given a scholarship to actually focus in on. So just really, really grateful, that I have that opportunity, then have two amazing supervisors that believed in me. So, I want to acknowledge them as Professor Mafanwe Maple, and she's the professor in social work in the School of Health with the UNE, and Associate Professor Sarah Wayland, again, the discipline lead in social work with the Faculty of Medicine and Health at UNE. So these two people have said, look, we like your proposal. We think that we believe in you. So that led me to going, okay, I'm going to do it. But still struggling, as much as I'm an actor, I'm struggling with this imposter syndrome. So being an actor, it's quite easy for me to say, hi, I'm Darren Wagner. I'm a researcher. I'm a PhD candidate, and I know what I'm doing. I don't. But I do know that I'm passionate and curious about the human experience, about how people endure resilience, how we suffer. That I've decided to do my research on what we call peer support work in mental health. So these are people that, like myself, like all of us, have had unique life experiences that have challenged them. And hopefully with some time and reflection, they've been able to look at what was, maybe macaroni art isn't the best approach. Now, that being said, I'm an absolute, and semi-practitioner of art therapy when it's the right time. Now, I've not finished my macaroni art yet, so when I finish my PhD, I've decided I'm also going to do that macaroni art on that pie plate, and I'm going to frame it because it's 30 years later. I'm ready to do the macaroni art. But yeah, so it's been an amazing journey. And quite passionate about this research, about how we address a workforce that is out there every day, working in suicide prevention with people. But they just don't have the support that other disciplines do. They haven't been recognized yet for their contributions, as well as their capacity to really help change some services in mental health.
So, I mean, that sounds so interesting. And we did speak a little bit about it. We were talking about wounded healers as against what you're talking about, and the value of having suffered in order to understand who you're working with. But can you tell us a little bit about your research? Have you yet even got as far as considering the methodology? You said you've written a research proposal. Have you done an ethics application? Where are you up to?
Oh, all the mess. Let's get into research now. Let's talk research.
Yes,
So I'm looking at candidature. So I guess that's going to be my first obstacle, is really proving that I have really looked at where this workforce is. So currently, that literature review is kind of where I'm sitting at the moment, is really looking at who has written about us, what have they found, and where are those gaps. So that's really kind of this past week is where I'm starting around that. Methodology is such a, and it's only been in the past week, and my poor supervisors, because I said, I think I need to do this differently after 6 months, because peer workers, much like the invitation to talk here today, is that when we hear people have a story, peer workers are seen as these people with lived experience that historically have been brought in to tell a story. So we'll have mental health clinicians that'll say, we're going to have a consumer come in and talk about the challenges of, maybe it's a woman that's experienced domestic violence, maybe it's someone who's been in the forensic system. So we're going to have this person that's going to share this story, which is powerful, absolutely, to hear from people that have had usually negative, sometimes positive experiences with certain types of services, counseling, therapies, modalities. What did you learn? What can we learn from you? But that's often where it stopped. So the peer workers have been seen as storytellers, brought in, paraded, almost as a show pony, to say, here's somebody, we're going to hear their story, and then the experts will then come in and we're going to address the real problem. So for me, my methodology, I want to find a very creative narrative. Obviously, I have a passion for this creativity, so I need to find a creative narrative I need to bring a storytelling approach to my data, because numbers aren't going to capture these experiences, these challenges, these strengths that people are wanting to bring to these roles. So I'm just starting to look at how storytelling and research in that. Definitely happy to talk to anyone that has expertise in this area. But I think I've really looked at, it was going to be a mixed methods. It definitely, obviously qualitative is really talking to people. So semi-structured interviews, mixed methods, but I really want to honor, not just talking to people, but finding a creative way that will bring out, the real stories that people need to hear. So that's kind of where I'm at this week. So that's where my
Wow.
brain is.
The creative part of it is what's intriguing. And so what I'm thinking about is, you've said semi-structured interviews, so that's going to be what you're going to do. So is part of the creative also how you're going to disseminate the results, how you're going to analyze the results, all of that?
And I want to interject creativity, in all of it, and especially the point of me doing this is so that that I leave something. So this is a legacy work for me. So I've said that all of the stories that I've heard are little golden threads. So there was even, I've lost friends to suicide that have talked to me. That there was even additional people survive, parents who've lost children that took their lives, a few years later, and these were actually researchers who were studying neurology, and very, very intelligent people that. So I want to find a way to take those threads, those stories, those little stories that I've heard from people that, no longer can tell those stories. Um, the interviews that I'm looking forward to happening with this workforce, and actually weaving that, and that's what my PhD will be, is taking those threads and weaving it into something that I can leave behind to say, here's some foundation work to build upon. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. I do joke, it would be nice to have the doctor in front of my name when I book airplane tickets. You get better seats, sometimes upgrades at hotels, but
It's
it's
not
not, it's
your
one of the few
motive.
labels. It's one of the few labels that I'm actually not interested in, and I've received a lot over the years. It's one that doesn't really interest me, but the work does.
It's an interesting point that you bring, dissemination, because you don't want it sitting collecting dust on a university shelf preaching to the converted. You want it to touch people and also be a legacy, not only to you, but to them as well. So that's where your creative juices are going to run. Who knows? It might be a Broadway production. I say that and then I
Oh,
hesitated because I didn't want it to be
all right.
flippant, but a Broadway production where
You're on the right track. Look, your dissemination is important, because I'm really passionate about that translational research, is the fact that when we do have, and I'm sure the students and the people that are watching this, when you contribute to that, it gets held in those vaults, those academic vaults, sometimes behind paywalls. When I'm a consumer and I'm struggling with my mental health, and I would love to access some of this knowledge, it's not going to happen on an inpatient unit, in a locked unit, in a hospital.
yeah.
So I want those people, those workforces that don't have access to the paywalls, I need it to be translated in a way that people can feel it. Look, I'm happy to disseminate at multiple levels. So there will be the ones with the graphs and all of the coding, and yes, I've met my academic rigors, and it's been, I want to prove to because I want the skeptics to know that, look, this is real. This is real research. But that dissemination process, I'm going to be asking. So as much as I would love to be creative, I want to create a very safe place for people to go, how would you like to receive this? And if they say, we would love for you to put on a play, we just might put on a play, Kathy. We will, and if we need music, why not make it a Broadway musical? Why not?
Well, it doesn't even have to be a musical, does it? It could be
It
more
does.
serious than that.
And as I had slightly alluded to, so there was a playwright that had been touched by our story, and he contacted us and he said, I'd like to come and interview members of your community. And I thought I couldn't imagine anything more bizarre. So I took the phone call. I said, look, one question. And that's what made me think about this was I said, you get one question. And he said, what? I said, is it a musical? He goes, no. I said, good. We can continue the conversation because I couldn't imagine why this person wants to write theater about what had happened to us.
Yeah.
So there is in theater called verbatim theater, where often communities are impacted by horrific events, and a playwright will come and interview the community, less about the actual event, but how did this resilience of the community, the stories, these little gems, and then the playwright will take these verbatim threads, go back and weave it into a little story, but it's verbatim. So I was told just a few months ago that there's been over 250 people who've played Darren
Wow.
around the world. The play is called 26 Pebbles. Basically talking about, so we had 20 children, 6 teachers that were murdered that day. And so it's like tossing a pebble into the water, it ripples. We saw it ripple around the world. We see it ripple to this day. It ripples within us. So beautiful. I've never seen it. I think as an aspiring actor, it was quite humbling to go that, I always wanted to be on stage, but I never realized that, I wouldn't probably be on stage again, but there would be people playing me on stage and telling this story about our
Important
community.
story.
Yeah, yeah. So it was quite powerful, and I get young people. There was a young man just 2 weeks ago that reached out to me on social media and said, "I'm playing you. Thank you. I'm really honored." But the really interesting thing is that we get directors every so often that contacts myself or my wife because she's in the play too, so we're in it together.
Yeah.
And so the directors will contact us and say, look, I've got somebody that's playing you, but they're actually becoming quite traumatized by this trauma content of this story. Do you have any resources, ideas? So I have, out of that challenge, created a new trauma informed. So it's trauma informed acting. So a way for people to actually take on those trauma stories. They already have their own stories. How they take on those trauma stories, tell it, come off stage, and de-roll. So cast that other role off safely. So finally, all of my worlds have collided. My interest in theater, drama, trauma, resilience. So I didn't finish a lot of careers. I didn't finish a lot of pathways, but they seem to have all collided at this moment in time.
Well, I'm not quite sure it's just collided. There seems to be that part of you that makes things happen. I mean, even to the point where I can't let people not know that you've even spoken with the Bessel van der Kolk. So you seek out the best and you find that knowledge and you work with it and you bring it to the people. So I don't just see it as a collision. I see that there's been some mechanism turning it too.
Look, and thank you for that. No, look, and Bessel was wonderful. Because when I realized about all of these little things that had been held in my body and how it had impacted me, and then I thanked him that he was on the board of the APA when DSM-3 came out, and that was the first time that PTSD was used as well as in a civilian context. So I said it's not often, and I gave him a big hug. I said it's not often that you get to meet your label maker. And he thought it was quite funny. And because I look, this PTSD is something you live with. And I said that, look, I'd love to go back to Boston. He's doing some really interesting trials around psychedelics. So I thought, well, maybe that might be the next chapter of my book. Darren goes and does the magic mushrooms with Bessel in Boston. So we'll wait and see how that goes. But it truly is great to meet people, and he has grown as a researcher and as an academic. So it's amazing to talk to people that believed something that impacted you, but now they've grown. And this is actually why I keep this on my shelf here. Is
Oh,
because We have
I think we froze a little
phrenology,
bit.
which
Oh,
was this
wow.
was the sense of the time. So at one time we would have been teaching this.
Well,
So
it's,
that
with neurobiology coming, it's kind of not coming, it's sort of growing and making such an impact on us. It's kind of
we're
a
we're,
little bit like that.
we're heading back there. It just that I don't trying to say that this is the part of my skull where hope is was a little bit silly, but it sits on my bookshelf as a reminder, along with.
Ah,
So these are two things that are quite powerful for me because I have been hopeless. My work in suicide prevention is all around that hopelessness. Um, so a lot of my work will be dedicated to that space as well.
well, one of my colleagues is Dennis O'Hara, who has done many studies on hope. So he'll be very happy to hear you talking about this.
I would love it because often when people say, well, what do peer workers do? And I say, look, my job is just to I can't fix you, I can't heal you, and I'm not even there to save someone's life, but I'm curious. And I love listening to stories, or I like to just sit with people because sometimes that's all they can do is I'll sit with somebody, and that's still communicating, very powerful. Some of the best work I've ever done as a counselor was when Darren kept his mouth shut, um, and let the stories come out. So that emotional, dark, vile vomiting that you will, but people feel better. And so I thought, well, I'm pretty good at that emotional vomiting, and I seem to be a good receptacle for it, in that space. But my job isn't to give people hope in that time. It's mainly to hold it for them. And then later on, if I get the privilege of continuing to work with them, I'm going to be very honest with them. And I'm like, look, I'm an old man. I've got a bad back and I'm lazy. So at some point, I will actually hand that back to you, because I'm just lazy. So I'm going to hand that hope back to you. And I physically have used this hundreds of times. I actually took it in my bag with me in the emergency rooms and stuff, and I would hand it to them, and they would, not metaphorically, but they that's why that was actually one person broke it because they clinched it so hard. So you talk about that holding on to hope and stuff, but at the right time. So maybe rap macaroni art isn't good the day after a suicide attempt. I don't know. I'm happy to do a study, but in my experience, maybe not the best approach. But I love this space. I love the work that you do. We need more researchers. We need more counselors that are trauma informed, curious. Unfortunately there's a lot of job security. I would like first of all to solve this problem so I can get back to being on stage. You know,
No,
I
no,
would
no.
love to return.
You're not going on stage just yet. Unfortunately, I've got to end it, but I'm just going to say, grab that curiosity, hold on to that curiosity, and we're busting to see what comes out of it. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be 3 years, but
Yeah.
maybe in the interim, you can come and talk to us about how that research is going and what your conversations have shown you already. That would be fabulous.
Look, absolutely. And like I said, you have my email and more than happy to connect. So I think as we're joking on LinkedIn, it's a very interesting, I don't do this other social medias as much, but I love building a like-minded community. So would love to hear from either fellow researchers, curious people, something that I can just add my voice to, or I would love to know the work that you're doing because I don't know what I don't know. So if you know what I don't know, please contact Kathy and send your contact information because I really would like to. I would really value having just a virtual coffee, if not a face-to-face at some point, around our shared work because that's how we solve it. There isn't a one approach. Whenever a counselor, clinician, hospital recommends a singularity approach to mental health or suicide, I pretty much run in the other direction. So our approaches can't be singular, and we need to come together and not be as territorial in our research and our papers and I understand research and funding, and I work with 7 universities, so I hear it every day. I'm there to try to bring people to the table to go, let's solve this problem, and then we can go back to other research, but there's certain issues that we need to come together on.
Well, I'm very pleased that you didn't run too fast in the opposite direction and that you've given us this time. I can't thank you enough. So thank you,
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Well,
I'm
thank you,
going to
Kathy.
end the recording now, but I don't have words enough to say thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.